June 6, 1944, 0316 hours. 15th Army Headquarters, Tourcoing, France. Generaloberst Hans von Salmuth stared at the intelligence reports covering his desk, trying to reconcile contradictory information flooding in from multiple sources. Heavy Allied bombing of the Pas-de-Calais continued. Resistance activity had intensified around Calais. Radio intercepts indicated the First U.S. Army Group, commanded by General George Patton, remained concentrated in southeastern England opposite Calais. Yet reports from Normandy were disturbing. Paratroopers had landed near Caen. Naval gunfire was hitting coastal positions. Radar stations reported massive formations approaching the Normandy coast. Von Salmuth reached for the phone to call OB West headquarters. His assessment was clear. Normandy was a diversion. The real invasion would come at Calais, where it made obvious strategic sense. The Allies were simply trying to draw German reserves away from the actual landing site. What von Salmuth didn't know, what the entire German high command couldn't imagine despite mounting evidence, was that the invasion they'd expected for 4 years was already underway. At that moment, 6,939 ships and landing craft were approaching Normandy, carrying 156,000 men. The largest amphibious invasion in human history was 3 hours from hitting the beaches. And the German forces positioned to repel it were paralyzed by the most successful deception operation in military history, one that convinced them the real invasion was still coming somewhere else, even as 156,000 Allied soldiers stormed ashore in Normandy. This is the story of how Allied deception defeated German intelligence, how 156,000 men landed while the enemy waited for the real invasion, and how the liberation of Europe succeeded because the Germans refused to believe what their own eyes were showing them. The German defensive strategy for France in 1944 rested on several fundamental assumptions. First, the Allies would invade at the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, only 21 miles from Dover. Here the crossing would be shortest, the air cover most effective, and the route to Germany most direct. Second, the initial landing would be followed by a larger main assault once German reserves committed to the first landing. Third, the invasion would come in daylight with good weather and favorable tides. These assumptions seemed logical, obvious even. They were shared by virtually every senior German commander. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, placed his strongest forces at Calais. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B responsible for coastal defense, fortified Calais most heavily. Hitler himself repeatedly insisted Calais would be the invasion point. The Germans were so certain about Calais that they deployed their most powerful formation, the 15th Army with 19 divisions, to defend it. Normandy, by contrast, received the weaker 7th Army with only 11 divisions to cover a much longer coastline. The disparity was deliberate. Calais mattered. Normandy didn't. This conviction stemmed partly from logic and partly from intelligence. German aerial reconnaissance showed massive concentrations of landing craft, tanks, and troops in southeastern England opposite Calais. Radio intercepts revealed extensive communications from the First U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, headquartered in that region. Agents reported constant activity around Dover and Folkestone. Everything pointed to Calais. What the Germans didn't realize was that every piece of evidence was manufactured. The landing craft were inflatable rubber dummies. The tanks were plywood and canvas mock-ups sitting on truck chassis. FUSAG didn't exist. It was a phantom army created by Allied deception planners. The radio traffic was scripted communications between non-existent units. The agents reporting to Germany were double agents controlled by British intelligence. The deception operation, codenamed Fortitude, was the most elaborate intelligence operation ever conducted. Involved thousands of personnel, consumed vast resources, and operated for over a year before D-Day. Its objective was simple: convince the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais, and keep them convinced even after the actual landing at Normandy. Fortitude South, the component targeting Calais, created the entirely fictional FUSAG commanded by General George Patton. The Germans respected and feared Patton, They assumed the Allies would give their most aggressive general the most important mission. Fortitude planners exploited this by making Patton visible, giving speeches, attending ceremonies, always in southeastern England. German intelligence concluded that wherever Patton was, the invasion would be. Meanwhile, the actual invasion forces assembled in southwestern England, Devon, Dorset, Hampshire, Sussex. Over 1 million men gathered in camps scattered across southern England. Thousands of ships and landing craft assembled in ports from Falmouth to Newhaven. The concentration was so massive that concealing it completely was impossible. But Fortitude created enough confusion that German intelligence couldn't distinguish real preparations from fake ones. When reconnaissance aircraft photographed genuine assault craft in Portsmouth, the intelligence analyst noted that even more craft appeared visible near Dover. They were seeing both the real invasion force and the fake Calais force simultaneously, unable to determine which was which. The double agents controlled by British intelligence through Operation Double Cross were critical. These were German spies who had been captured, turned, and now sent carefully crafted false information to their German handlers. The most valuable was one Pugil Garcia, codenamed Garbo by the British and Arabelle by the Germans. Garbo had created an entire fictional spy network of 27 subagents, supposedly scattered across Britain. In reality, Garbo and his British intelligence handlers in London fabricated every report. But the Germans trusted him implicitly. His information had proven accurate in the past when British intelligence wanted it to be, and he appeared to have access to high-level intelligence. In the months before D-Day, Garbo reported obsessively about Fusag preparations around Dover. He described units, equipment, training exercises, all fictional, all designed to reinforce German belief in a Calais invasion. German intelligence praised his reports as the most valuable intelligence they possessed about Allied invasion preparations. The naval deception was equally sophisticated. The Allies created entire phantom fleets that appeared on German radar, but didn't exist. Small boats towing radar reflectors created signatures identical to large convoy formations. Aircraft dropped clouds of aluminum foil called window that created false returns suggesting massive air formations. German radar operators saw phantom invasions approaching at multiple points along the French coast. When the real invasion came at Normandy, it looked like just another phantom. The airborne assault that opened the invasion should have provided final confirmation that Normandy was the real thing. Shortly after midnight on June 6, 23,000 American and British paratroopers and glider troops began landing behind the Normandy beaches. This was the largest airborne operation attempted to date. Surely it indicated the main effort? German commanders didn't interpret it that way. Oberst General Friedrich Dahlmann, commanding the 7th Army in Normandy, believed the airborne drops were designed to draw reserves away from Calais. Major Hans von Luck, commanding a panzer regiment near Caen, requested permission to attack the paratroopers immediately but was ordered to wait. Higher headquarters wanted to see where the main invasion developed before committing reserves. At 0500 hours, naval bombardment began. 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, and 65 destroyers opened fire on the Normandy coast. The shelling was concentrated, devastating, and clearly preparatory to landing. Coastal defenders radioed desperate reports that they were being pulverized. Still, German high command hesitated. Von Rundstedt's chief of staff, General Lieutenant Blumentritt, later testified, "We believed Normandy was a diversion. The naval forces seemed impressive, but not overwhelming. We expected the real invasion fleet, which must be larger, to appear at Calais once we committed our reserves to Normandy. This was exactly the trap we were determined not to fall into." At 0630 hours, the first assault waves hit the beaches. On Utah Beach, the 4th U.S. Infantry Division landed with relatively light casualties. On Omaha Beach, the 1st and 29th U.S. Infantry Divisions faced murderous fire and took horrific casualties but maintained their foothold. On Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, British and Canadian forces pushed inland against fierce resistance. By 0800 hours, 30,000 Allied soldiers were ashore across 5 beaches. German defenders were fighting desperately, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and receiving no reinforcements. The units positioned directly on the beaches fought well, but they were dying in place with no support. The critical moment came at 0900 hours when Hitler's headquarters finally woke. The Führer had been sleeping and his staff refused to wake him for the initial reports. When briefed, Hitler reportedly said, "So, we have the invasion. But is it the invasion?" Even the supreme commander of German forces believed Normandy might be a feint. The paralysis this belief created was catastrophic for German defense. The most powerful German formation in France, the Panzer Reserves near Paris, remained motionless. These divisions, the 12th SS Panzer, Panzer Lehr, and the 116th Panzer, could have counterattacked the beaches on D-Day if committed immediately. Instead, they waited for orders that didn't come. Rommel was absent on D-Day, having returned to Germany for his wife's birthday and to petition Hitler for more authority over the Panzer Reserves. He received word of the invasion at 0630 hours and immediately began the long drive back to France, but wouldn't reach his headquarters until evening. His absence removed the one commander who might have ordered immediate counterattack without waiting for higher authorization. Von Rundstedt requested release of the Panzer Reserves at 1000 hours. The request went to OKW, Hitler's supreme headquarters. Hitler was in conference and couldn't be disturbed. The reserves remained motionless. At 1400 hours, Hitler finally authorized release of 2 panzer divisions to move toward Normandy. But by then, the Allies had 57,000 men ashore across all beaches, with more landing every minute. The panzer divisions attempted to move toward Normandy on June 6 afternoon, but were devastated by Allied air power. The overwhelming Allied air superiority meant that German movement in daylight was suicidal. Columns were spotted and attacked by fighter bombers before they could reach the battle. The 12th SS Panzer Division, ordered to counterattack on D-Day, didn't reach the front until June 7th after losing heavily to air attack during movement. Meanwhile, the deception continued. At 2200 hours on June 6th, Garbo transmitted a message to his German handlers that would prove decisive. He reported that Fusag remained in southeastern England, that the troops committed to Normandy were predominantly Canadian and British, and that American forces, particularly Patton's First Army, were conspicuously absent from the Normandy operation. His assessment, Normandy was a diversionary attack to draw German reserves away from Calais, where the main invasion would strike with Fusag once German forces committed to Normandy. German intelligence found Garbo's analysis brilliantly insightful. It confirmed their own suspicions. A message went from German intelligence to all commands. The present assault is not the main invasion. The main Allied force remains concentrated opposite the Pas-de-Calais. Expect second larger invasion within days. Do not overcommit to Normandy operations. This message, based entirely on fabricated intelligence from a double agent, paralyzed German response for crucial days. The 15th Army, with 19 divisions positioned at Calais, remained in place waiting for an invasion that would never come. These divisions could have moved to Normandy and potentially driven the Allies back into the sea. Instead, they sat idle for weeks, while the Normandy beachhead consolidated and expanded. By the end of D-Day, 156,000 Allied soldiers were ashore in Normandy. American forces on Utah and Omaha beaches held precarious footholds. British and Canadian forces on Gold, Juno, and Sword had pushed several miles inland. The airborne forces behind the beaches had secured key objectives despite being scattered during the drop. The casualties were heavy, roughly 10,000 Allied soldiers killed or wounded, but the operation had succeeded beyond the most optimistic planning estimates. German casualties on D-Day were approximately 4,000 to 9,000, with exact figures unknown due to the chaos. But more significant than casualties was the strategic paralysis. German forces in Normandy fought bravely but received no reinforcements. The powerful reserves sat idle, waiting for the real invasion at Calais. The days following D-Day saw the beachhead expand relentlessly. By June 7th, 326,000 Allied troops were ashore, with 104,000 tons of supplies. By June 11th, all 5 beaches were connected into a continuous lodgment 60 miles wide and 10 miles deep. Over 326,000 troops, 54,000 vehicles, and 104,000 tons of supplies had been landed. The buildup pace exceeded planning estimates. The Allies were landing troops and equipment faster than the Germans could move forces to contain them. Still, the Germans hesitated to commit fully to Normandy. Hitler repeatedly insisted that Calais remained the objective. Von Rundstedt pleaded for permission to move the 15th Army from Calais to Normandy. Hitler refused. The 15th Army remained at Calais, guarding against an invasion that existed only in Allied deception plans and German fears. Rommel, back at his headquarters, recognized that Normandy was indeed the main invasion. He argued vehemently for committing all reserves to destroying the beachhead before it became too powerful. But Hitler overruled him. The Führer remained convinced that committing to Normandy would leave Calais vulnerable to the larger invasion. The impact of this belief was catastrophic. For 3 critical weeks after D-Day, while the Allies poured men and material into Normandy, the German 15th Army sat idle at Calais. When finally released piecemeal in late June and early July, these divisions arrived in Normandy exhausted from movement under air attack, fed into battle as they arrived rather than concentrated for coordinated counterattack, and discovered they were facing an Allied force that now numbered over 800,000 men. The deception's effectiveness exceeded even Allied expectations. Fortitude planners had hoped to deceive the Germans for perhaps a week after D-Day. Instead, the Germans remained convinced that Calais was threatened until late July, 7 weeks after the actual invasion. During those 7 weeks, the entire German defensive strategy in France revolved around guarding against an invasion that would never happen, while the real invasion consolidated and broke out. The operational impact was decisive. Allied planners had estimated they would need until August or September to break out from the Normandy beachhead. Instead, by late July, they had liberated most of Normandy and were positioned for the breakout into France. The primary reason for this accelerated timeline was German failure to commit forces rapidly enough to contain the beachhead, a failure driven directly by continued belief that Normandy was a feint. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr Division, expressed the German perspective in post-war interrogation. We knew a massive force had landed in Normandy. We could see it growing daily. But higher headquarters insisted this wasn't the main effort. They kept telling us to be ready to move to Calais when the real invasion came. We stayed in reserve positions near Paris for days, then were committed to Normandy piecemeal, and arrived to find the situation hopeless. By the time leadership acknowledged Normandy was the invasion, the Allies had 2 million men ashore, and we couldn't push them back into the sea with all the forces in France. The numbers tell the story starkly. On June 6th, the Allies had 156,000 troops in Normandy opposed by approximately 50,000 German troops in the immediate area. By June 12th, the Allies had 326,000 troops in Normandy, while German forces in the region had grown to only 200,000. By June 18th, the disparity was 629,000 Allied troops to 280,000 Germans. The Allies were winning the build-up race decisively because German reinforcements were arriving slowly, grudgingly, and always too late. The decisive battle for Normandy came in late July during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the western end of the beachhead. By then, the Allies had 39 divisions in Normandy, totaling 1.5 million men. German forces numbered 400,000 men in 38 divisions, but these divisions were at 50% strength or less, battered by weeks of combat and air attack. The German army in Normandy was outnumbered nearly 4-1, a disparity that should never have occurred if the 15th Army at Calais had been committed in June. Operation Cobra, launched July 25th, shattered German defenses in the west. American forces poured through the gap, liberating Brittany and swinging east toward Paris. The German army in Normandy attempted to counterattack at Mortain on August 7th, but was destroyed by overwhelming Allied air power. By August 25th, Paris was liberated. By September 1st, Allied forces had reached the German border. The campaign that German planners had expected to take months, that they believed could be contained and possibly defeated, instead lasted less than 3 months and ended with German forces in France destroyed or in full retreat. The primary reason was the catastrophic initial deployment based on false assumptions that Normandy was a feint. Post-war analysis revealed the full extent of the deception. German intelligence had received accurate information about Normandy from multiple sources. French resistance had reported the buildup in southwestern England. Aerial reconnaissance had photographed genuine invasion preparations. Some agents had correctly identified Normandy as the target. But this accurate intelligence was discounted or dismissed because it contradicted the mountain of false intelligence supporting Calais. German intelligence made a fundamental error. They believed information that confirmed their assumptions and dismissed information that contradicted them. This confirmation bias, combined with the sheer scale and sophistication of fortitude, created a situation where the Germans couldn't distinguish truth from deception. The irony was that some German officers suspected the truth. General Leopold von Schweppenberg, commanding Panzer Group West, argued before D-Day that Normandy was more likely than Calais. His reasoning was sound. Normandy offered better beaches, weaker defenses, and once captured would provide excellent ports. But his analysis was overruled by superiors who insisted Calais was the obvious objective. After the invasion, as evidence mounted that Normandy was indeed the main effort, German leadership remained in denial. Hitler held a conference on June 17th where he insisted that Normandy was a diversion and that the real invasion at Calais was imminent. Rommel and von Rundstedt argued that the evidence clearly showed Normandy was the invasion and all forces should be committed there. Hitler responded that this was exactly what the Allies wanted, to draw German forces into Normandy so Calais would be weakened. The psychological inability to admit error compounded the military disaster. German leadership had convinced themselves so thoroughly that Calais was the target that contradictory evidence couldn't penetrate their certainty. This cognitive rigidity, this refusal to adapt to new information, was as damaging as the initial deception. The human cost of the deception was significant. Allied casualties on D-Day were approximately 10,000 killed and wounded. German casualties are estimated at 4,000 to 9,000. But these figures obscure the strategic reality. If the German panzer reserves had counterattacked on D-Day or June 7th, Allied casualties might have been catastrophic, and the invasion might have failed. The deception kept those panzers idle, and their absence made Allied victory possible at acceptable cost. For the Germans, the consequences were devastating. The failure to contain the Normandy beachhead led directly to the loss of France, the destruction of Army Group B, and the exposure of Germany's western frontier. The German army in France in June 1944 numbered approximately 850,000 men in 60 divisions. By September 1944, this force had been reduced to scattered remnants fleeing toward Germany. Over 400,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in France in 3 months. The intelligence failure that caused this disaster was so complete that German officers spent years after the war trying to understand how they'd been so thoroughly deceived. General Blumentritt wrote in his memoirs, "The Allied deception was the most perfect in military history. They made us see what they wanted us to see, believe what they wanted us to believe. Even when evidence contradicted our beliefs, we found ways to explain it that preserved our conviction that Calais was the target. We were not stupid men. We simply couldn't imagine that intelligence could be fabricated on such scale, with such consistency, for so long. We trusted our intelligence sources, not knowing they were controlled by the enemy. The result was catastrophic failure at the decisive moment. The strategic implications extended beyond Normandy. The Allied success in France led directly to Germany's defeat within a year. If the Normandy invasion had been contained or defeated, the war would have continued, possibly for years. The deception that enabled Normandy's success was therefore instrumental in ending the war in Europe. modern intelligence professionals study fortitude as the gold standard of strategic deception. The operation demonstrated that properly executed deception can paralyze enemy decision-making at the strategic level. The Germans weren't merely surprised by the invasion location. They remained deceived about the invasion location for weeks after it occurred. This prolonged deception provided time for the lodgment to become unassailable. The technical aspects of the deception were sophisticated for 1944 and remain instructive today. The Phantom Fusag was maintained through multiple channels: visual fake equipment, electronic radio traffic, human intelligence, double agents, and documentary, fabricated military communications. This multi-source reinforcement made the deception robust against detection. Even if the Germans discovered that one channel was false, other channels continued to confirm the story. The psychological understanding of German leadership was equally sophisticated. Fortitude planners knew the Germans expected Calais for logical strategic reasons. Rather than fighting this expectation, they reinforced it. They knew Patton was feared and respected, so they made him visible in southeastern England. They knew Hitler would insist on retaining personal control of panzer reserves, so they crafted a scenario that made Hitler's caution seem prudent rather than paralyzing. The operational security maintained by the Allies was remarkable. Over 1 million people in southern England knew about the invasion preparations. Yet German intelligence learned nothing useful from this massive security breach waiting to happen. The combination of censorship, counterintelligence, and population cooperation kept the secret. When German agents tried to gather information, they were identified and arrested or turned into double agents. The final assessment must acknowledge that the Germans contributed to their own deception. Their preconceptions about where the invasion should logically occur made them vulnerable to deception, confirming those preconceptions. Their intelligence analysis suffered from confirmation bias. Their command structure created delays and confusion that prevented rapid response. And their leadership, particularly Hitler, insisted on maintaining control of reserves while being physically distant from the battlefield. But even counting for German mistakes, the Allied achievement in fortitude and overlord remains extraordinary. To plan an operation involving 156,000 troops, 6,939 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and millions of tons of supplies, and to keep the location secret until it happened, defied all probability. To then execute that plan flawlessly on D-Day exceeded all reasonable expectations. The soldiers who landed on Normandy's beaches didn't know about fortitude. They didn't know that German reserves were paralyzed by deception. They knew only that they were running into withering fire from defenders who had years to prepare positions. That the casualties weren't far worse. That the invasion succeeded despite fierce resistance owed much to the strategic deception that kept German reinforcements away from the critical beaches during the critical hours. By evening of June 6, 1944, Allied forces held a continuous beachhead in Normandy. The lodgment was precarious, the fighting was brutal, but the invasion had succeeded. Behind the beaches, 156,000 Allied soldiers were digging in, knowing that German counterattacks would come. What they couldn't know was that the counterattacks would be delayed, weakened, and uncoordinated because German high command remained convinced that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. The German generals who insisted Normandy was a feint would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain how they'd been so completely deceived. But the explanation was simple. They saw what the Allies wanted them to see, believed what the Allies wanted them to believe. And by the time they recognized the truth, 156,000 Allied soldiers had become 2 million, and the liberation of Europe was inevitable. The story of June 6, 1944 is told as military triumph. And it was. But it was also intelligence triumph, the success of deception over analysis, of carefully crafted lies over logical assumptions. The Germans thought Normandy was a feint. The 156,000 men who landed there proved it was the main event. And by the time German leadership acknowledged that truth, it was far too late to change the outcome. The war in Europe would continue for 11 more months, But its conclusion was written in the sand of Normandy's beaches on that June morning when 156,000 men came ashore, while the enemy waited for the real invasion somewhere else.